In 1934, baseball didn't wear a smile. It clenched its jaw. It played through bruises, and it dared you to stand in its way. Fans weren't looking for poetry on the diamond. They wanted a fight. And they found it in a team that didn't care about manners, reputations, or apologies. They were loud. They were dirty. They were relentless. They were the St. Louis Cardinals, better known at the time as the Gashouse Gang. Waiting for them were the Detroit Tigers, a team powered by one of the greatest hitters who ever lived, the phenomenal Hank Greenberg. What followed wasn't just a World Series. It was a street brawl disguised as a baseball game. The stage was set for a clash of titans, a battle of completely different philosophies. Detroit had raw power. Hank Greenberg hit baseballs like they owed him money. His teammate, second baseman Charlie Gehringer, was nicknamed the Mechanical Man for his smooth, calm, and precise play. The Tigers believed in muscle and momentum, a classic approach to overwhelming their opponents with sheer talent and force. St. Louis, on the other hand, believed in war. Led by their fiery player-manager, Frankie Frisch, the Cardinals were a pack of wolves. They ran wild on the bases, turning every walk into a potential triple. They heckled relentlessly from the dugout, trying to get into the heads of their opponents. They treated pain as a strategy and saw every single play as an opportunity to intimidate. They didn't just want to win the game. They wanted to break you. This was the Gashouse Gang, a name they earned for their unkempt appearance and their gritty, no-holds-barred style of play. They were a reflection of the hard times, a team that fought for every inch because they had to. Game 1 kicked off on October 3, 1934, at Navin Field in Detroit. The Tigers, confident in their home field advantage and their powerful lineup, expected a strategic chess match. Instead, they got punched in the mouth. The Cardinals came out swinging, both literally and figuratively. They ran early. They ran often. They never stopped talking, their chatter echoing from the dugout and the base paths. And then there was Joe Medwick, a man nicknamed Ducky, who swung his bat like he was personally insulted by the baseball itself. He was the heart of their aggressive offense. The Cardinals battered Detroit's pitching, piling on runs and making the Tigers' defense look flustered and unprepared. The final score was a lopsided 8-1 victory for St. Louis, but the scoreboard didn't tell the whole story. The real story was written in the shock on the faces of the Detroit players and their fans. The Tigers had just learned something terrifying. This series was not going to be polite. It was going to be a war. The Gashouse Gang had officially arrived, and they weren't asking for permission to take over. After the shock of Game 1, Detroit responded the only way it could, with overwhelming force. In Game 2, the Tigers' bats woke up, and they woke up angry. Hank Greenberg, determined to put his team back on track, started crushing pitches, sending them deep into the Detroit outfield. The entire Tigers lineup followed his lead, pounding the Cardinals' pitching staff for hit after hit. The home crowd, which had been stunned into silence in the first game, roared back to life with every crack of the bat. The game quickly turned into a rout. The final score was an astonishing 12-3 demolition by Detroit. The message was loud and clear. If St. Louis wanted a fight, Detroit was more than willing to throw punches too. They had the muscle to match the Cardinals' grit. The series was now tied, 1 game apiece. But anyone who thought the Gashouse Gang would be discouraged by a blowout loss didn't know them at all. They didn't get down. They got angrier. The stage was now set for the series to shift to St. Louis, where the chaos was about to reach a whole new level. The series moved to Sportsman's Park in St. Louis for Game 3, and this is where it stopped being a World Series and started becoming a legend. The Cardinals, now in front of their own passionate, rowdy fans, fully embraced their Gashouse identity. They scratched, they clawed, and they provoked their way to runs. Every play was a battle, every stolen base was an act of defiance. The benches for both teams were constantly barking at each other, with insults and threats flying across the diamond. Umpires had to step in repeatedly, issuing warnings and trying to keep a lid on the simmering tension. The fans in St. Louis were just as intense as their team, screaming and yelling with every pitch. Fueled by this chaotic energy, St. Louis managed to pull out a hard-fought 4-1 victory, taking back control of the series. But as the game ended, you could feel that something darker was brewing. The temperature, both emotionally and literally, was rising. The series wasn't just competitive anymore. It was personal. And what happened next would ensure that the 1934 World Series would be remembered forever, for all the wrong reasons. Game 4 is where this series became truly infamous. It was the moment that the simmering hostility boiled over into outright ugliness. It all centered around one man, Joe Medwick. Medwick, the Cardinals' star outfielder and the league's most feared hitter, was known for his aggressive style. In the sixth inning, he tripled, sliding hard, very hard into third base. Spikes were high. Dust flew everywhere. He collided with the Tigers' third baseman, Marv Owen. Owen and Medwick exchanged words. The Detroit players on the bench erupted in anger, believing Medwick's slide was intentionally dirty. The crowd, already on edge, followed suit. When Medwick took his position in left field for the next inning, the Detroit fans unleashed their fury. Beer bottles, fruit, vegetables, seat cushions, anything they could get their hands on, rained down from the stands, all aimed at him. The game had to be stopped. The umpires pleaded with the crowd, but every time they tried to restart, more debris flew onto the field. They feared they were losing control completely. So, the commissioner of baseball, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, made an almost unthinkable decision. He ordered Joe Medwick to be removed from the game, not for breaking a rule, but for his own safety. The Cardinals were furious, but they had no choice. The Tigers went on to win the game 10-4, tying the series once again. But the damage was done. This series was now officially out of control. If the Detroit fans thought they'd scared the Cardinals by showering Joe Medwick with garbage, they were dead wrong. The Cardinals didn't just endure the chaos, they fed on it. For Game 5, back in St. Louis, the Gashouse Gang came out with even more fire and fury. They saw the attack on their star player as a declaration of war, and they responded in kind. They ran harder. They slid meaner. They talked louder. Every single at-bat felt like a personal challenge. Every inning felt like a dare. The atmosphere in Sportsman's Park was electric. The Cardinals were playing with a chip on their shoulder the size of the Gateway Arch. They manufactured runs through sheer grit and aggression, putting relentless pressure on the Tigers' defense. The Tigers fought back, but they seemed rattled by the Cardinals' intensity and the hostile environment. In the end, St. Louis scratched out a 4-3 victory, taking a 3-2 series lead. They were now just one win away from a championship. They had absorbed Detroit's best punch, and now they had one punch left to throw. Facing elimination in Game 6, with the series returning to Detroit, the Tigers leaned on their stars. It was do or die, and they played like it. Hank Greenberg, who had been a force all series, delivered once again at the plate. The Tigers' pitching, which had been inconsistent, finally found its groove. They completely shut down the relentless Cardinals' offense, silencing the Gashouse Gang for one crucial game. The Detroit bats came alive, and they cruised to a comfortable 3-1 victory, forcing a decisive winner-take-all Game 7. The crowd in Detroit believed again. Their team had shown incredible resilience, refusing to die, and now all of baseball braced itself. Because Game 7 was coming. All the anger, all the aggression, all the bad blood from the past 6 games would finally come to a head in one final brutal contest. October 9, 1934, Game 7. Everything came down to this. The tension in Navin Field was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The Cardinals struck first, manufacturing a run in the very first inning, a classic Gashouse Gang-style score. But Detroit answered immediately, showing they wouldn't go down without a fight. The lead changed hands, and for a few innings, the game was a nail-biter. The pressure tightened with every pitch. Then came the moment that perfectly defined the Gashouse Gang. It wasn't one big home run, it was death by 1,000 cuts. The Cardinals ran on everything. They pressured the Tigers' fielders, forcing them into mistakes. In the third inning, they blew the game wide open, scoring 7 runs by capitalizing on Detroit's errors and their own relentless, aggressive base running. They didn't just beat the Tigers. They dismantled them piece by piece. By the late innings, the Detroit team was bleeding emotionally and on the scoreboard. The final score was St. Louis 11, Detroit 0, a blowout. A statement. A championship forged in fury. The Cardinals were champions. But they became more than that. They were immortalized. The 1934 World Series became shorthand for everything that old-time baseball used to be. Brutal, emotional, unapologetic, and absolutely ruthless. They were a team that perfectly matched the spirit of their era. Joe Medwick, the man at the center of the controversy, would go on to win the Triple Crown that year, one of the rarest feats in baseball. Hank Greenberg would become a legend in his own right, a Hall of Famer and a cultural icon. But that series, that moment in time, belonged to the Gashouse Gang. They didn't just win the World Series. They redefined how far a team was willing to go to win it. They played with a level of aggression and intensity that shocked the sporting world. There were no smiles. There was no mercy. And there were absolutely no regrets. The 1934 World Series wasn't pretty. It wasn't clean. And it certainly wasn't safe. But it was real. It was a raw, unfiltered reflection of a nation struggling through hard times, a nation that appreciated a good fight. And for 9 days' worth of rage, compressed into 7 incredible games, baseball stopped being a gentleman's sport. It showed its teeth. Thanks so much for watching. If you love stories about the legends of sports history, make sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.